The most chilling social experiments ever conducted ranked. The experiments that revealed what ordinary people are really capable of. Why social experiments still disturb us today. Most people believe they know exactly how they would behave under pressure. They imagine they would challenge authority, refuse immoral orders, help a stranger in need, and resist social pressure when everyone else is going along with something they know is wrong. It is a comforting belief. It is also one that psychology has repeatedly challenged. For more than a century, researchers have designed experiments to uncover the hidden forces that shape human behavior. Some were conducted in universities. Others took place in classrooms, hospitals, summer camps, and eventually even on social media platforms used by millions of people. Their methods varied dramatically, but many reached a similar conclusion. Human behavior is far more influenced by circumstances than most people would like to admit. What makes these experiments so fascinating is not that they studied criminals, extremists, or people with unusual personalities. Most participants were completely ordinary individuals. They were students, teachers, nurses, office workers, and members of the public. In many cases, they behaved in ways that shocked both researchers and themselves. The most disturbing implication is that these experiments were not really about the people who participated in them. They were about all of us. They exposed vulnerabilities that exist within almost every human being. They revealed how authority can override conscience, how groups can reshape perception, and how social pressure can quietly alter decisions without us even noticing. Decades later, these studies remain among the most important ever conducted because they force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps human nature is more predictable than we would like to believe. The Lost Letter Experiment. Compared with some of the more famous studies on this list, the Lost Letter Experiment appears remarkably harmless. There were no shocking machines, prison cells, or confrontations. Instead, researchers simply left stamped and addressed letters in public places and waited to see whether strangers would post them. The goal was deceptively simple. Rather than asking people what they thought about different organizations or causes, researchers wanted to observe their behavior. Some letters were addressed to respected organizations, while others were addressed to groups viewed less favorably by the public. By measuring how many letters were mailed, psychologists could gain insight into social attitudes without participants even realizing they were part of a study. The findings demonstrated that people's actions often reveal more than their stated beliefs. Letters associated with popular organizations were generally returned more frequently than those linked to controversial groups. This offered an unusually honest glimpse into public opinion, because there was no opportunity for participants to provide socially desirable answers. The experiment may seem minor compared with later studies, but its influence remains enormous. Today, companies, governments, and technology platforms analyze behavior rather than relying solely on surveys. Every click, purchase, share, and interaction leaves a behavioral trail. The Lost Letter Experiment demonstrated decades ago that what people do is often more revealing than what they say. The Good Samaritan Experiment. The Good Samaritan Experiment asked a surprisingly uncomfortable question. Does being a good person actually make someone more likely to help others? Researchers recruited seminary students and asked them to walk across campus to deliver a presentation. Some students were told they had plenty of time. Others were told they were running late. Along the way, each participant encountered a person who appeared to be in distress and potentially in need of assistance. One detail made the experiment particularly striking. Some participants were on their way to give a talk about the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan itself. If moral beliefs alone determined behavior, these individuals should have been especially likely to stop and help. That is not what happened. The strongest predictor of helping behavior was not religious commitment, personal values, or even the topic of the presentation. It was time pressure. Participants who believed they were late were dramatically less likely to stop and offer assistance. The implications remain deeply relevant today. Modern life is increasingly defined by deadlines, schedules, notifications, and constant demands on attention. The Good Samaritan experiment suggests that compassion often competes with urgency. Many people do not ignore others because they lack empathy. They ignore them because they are distracted, rushed, and overwhelmed. In a world that moves faster every year, that lesson may be more important than ever. The Facebook emotional contagion experiment. For decades, social experiments took place inside laboratories and universities. The Facebook emotional contagion experiment showed what happens when social experimentation moves online. In 2014, researchers studied whether emotions could spread through social networks. By altering the emotional content displayed in users' news feeds, they examined whether exposure to more positive or more negative posts influenced the emotional tone of users' own updates. The scale of the study was unprecedented. Nearly 700,000 users were involved. Unlike traditional psychology experiments involving dozens or hundreds of participants, this research operated on a scale that earlier psychologists could never have imagined. The findings suggested that emotions could indeed spread through digital environments. Users exposed to more positive content tended to post slightly more positive updates themselves, while those exposed to more negative content displayed the opposite pattern. What made the experiment controversial was not simply the result. It was the realization that digital platforms possessed the ability to influence emotional environments at extraordinary scale. Millions of people increasingly receive information through algorithmically curated feeds, yet few fully understand how those systems shape what they see and how they feel. The experiment became a symbol of a broader shift in society. Social influence was no longer confined to physical communities, classrooms, workplaces, or families. Algorithms had become active participants in shaping human behavior. The laboratory had expanded to encompass the entire internet. The Asch conformity experiments. If there is one experiment that demonstrates the power of social pressure in its purest form, it is Solomon Asch's conformity studies. Participants were shown a simple task, involving lines of different lengths. The correct answer was obvious. In fact, the task was deliberately designed to be almost impossible to get wrong. However, there was a catch. Everyone else in the room was secretly working with the researchers. One by one, these individuals deliberately gave the wrong answer. The real participant always answered last, after hearing an entire group confidently agree on something that was clearly false. The question was simple. Would people trust their own eyes or follow the crowd? The answer shocked many observers. A significant proportion of participants abandoned their own judgment and agreed with the incorrect majority. Even when the correct answer was obvious, social pressure proved surprisingly powerful. Perhaps the most fascinating finding emerged when researchers introduced a single dissenter. When just one other person broke from the group and gave the correct answer, conformity rates dropped dramatically. This revealed something profoundly important about human psychology. People do not necessarily need overwhelming support to resist social pressure. Sometimes they simply need proof that they are not alone. The Asch experiments continue to influence our understanding of workplace culture, politics, social media, and public opinion. They remind us that conformity often emerges not because people believe something is true, but because disagreement can feel uncomfortable, risky, or isolating. The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. In 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., teacher Jane Elliott conducted an exercise that would become one of the most famous classroom demonstrations in history. She divided her students into two groups based entirely on eye color. One group was told they were superior. They received privileges, praise, and preferential treatment. The other group faced restrictions, criticism, and lower status. The categories were entirely arbitrary. That was precisely the point. The results appeared almost immediately. Students assigned to the higher status group often became more confident and assertive. Some even became dismissive or hostile toward those in the lower status category. Meanwhile, many students assigned lower status became quieter, less confident, and more anxious. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the speed at which these changes occurred. The children had known one another for months. Yet a completely artificial hierarchy rapidly altered behavior and self-perception. The experiment demonstrated how easily social identities can be created and reinforced. Status, privilege, and discrimination do not simply affect how people are treated. They influence how people think, perform, and see themselves. The lessons extend far beyond the classroom. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to signals of belonging, status, and social value. Once a group identity is established, even arbitrary distinctions can begin to feel meaningful and real. That reality helps explain everything from school cliques to workplace politics, tribal loyalties, and large-scale social divisions. The robber's cave experiment. If the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment revealed how quickly divisions can emerge, the robber's cave experiment demonstrated how easily group conflict can be manufactured. Researchers brought a group of boys to a summer camp in Oklahoma and divided them into two separate groups. Initially, the boys developed friendships and identities within their own teams. They created names, traditions, and a sense of shared belonging. Then, the researchers introduced competition. Almost immediately, hostility began to emerge. Rivalries intensified. Insults appeared. The groups became increasingly suspicious and antagonistic toward one another. What made the experiment so important was that these divisions had not emerged naturally. They had been deliberately created through circumstances engineered by researchers. Even more revealing was what happened next. Attempts to reduce hostility through simple contact largely failed. The groups continued to distrust one another. However, when researchers introduced larger challenges requiring cooperation, the hostility gradually diminished. Shared goals proved more effective than lectures, discussions, or forced interaction. The Robber's Cave experiment remains one of the clearest demonstrations of how tribalism develops. It showed that conflict often emerges not because groups are fundamentally different, but because circumstances encourage competition and division. Equally important, it showed that cooperation can sometimes overcome divisions when people recognize that they need one another to succeed. The bystander effect experiments. Few psychological discoveries are as unsettling as the bystander effect because it challenges a comforting assumption. Most people believe that if they witnessed an emergency, someone would step forward and help. Researchers John Darley and Bib Latane became interested in this question after a series of highly publicized incidents raised concerns about public inaction during emergencies. They designed experiments to test how the presence of other people influenced helping behavior. In one of the most famous versions, participants believed they were taking part in a discussion over an intercom system. During the conversation, one participant appeared to suffer a medical emergency. The real participant then had to decide whether to intervene. The results were striking. The more people participants believed were listening, the less likely they were to act quickly. Responsibility seemed to dissolve as group size increased. This phenomenon became known as diffusion of responsibility. When many people witness a problem, each individual assumes somebody else will take action. Ironically, the presence of more potential helpers can make assistance less likely. The implications reach far beyond emergencies. Similar dynamics appear in workplaces, governments, organizations, and online communities. Problems can remain unresolved because everyone assumes someone else is responsible. The experiment revealed a paradox of human behavior. People are often willing to help. They simply become less likely to do so when surrounded by others who might help first. Understanding that tendency is one of the most effective ways to overcome it. The Hoffling Hospital experiment. Many people assume that professional training protects individuals from blind obedience. The Hoffling Hospital experiment challenged that belief in dramatic fashion. Conducted in the 1960s, the study examined how nurses responded to instructions from an unknown doctor. Participants received telephone calls directing them to administer a medication that violated multiple hospital policies. The instructions should have raised immediate concerns. The dosage exceeded recommended limits. The doctor was unfamiliar. Proper procedures had not been followed. Hospital rules clearly prohibited such action. Yet a surprising majority of nurses prepared to comply. Only intervention from the researchers prevented the instructions from being carried out. What makes the experiment so disturbing is that the participants were highly trained professionals. These were not inexperienced volunteers in an artificial laboratory. They were individuals working within a real healthcare environment. The study demonstrated the extraordinary influence of authority structures. Expertise, titles, and institutional hierarchies often create powerful assumptions about who should be trusted and obeyed. The broader lesson extends far beyond medicine. Every organization depends on authority relationships. Employees trust managers. Citizens trust officials. Students trust teachers. Specialists trust experts. Most of the time, those systems function effectively. However, the Hoffling experiment revealed that authority can sometimes override critical thinking, even among intelligent and experienced professionals. The ability to question instructions may be just as important as the willingness to follow them. The third wave experiment. The third wave experiment remains one of the most chilling demonstrations of how quickly authoritarian behavior can emerge under the right conditions. In 1967, high school teacher Ron Jones attempted to explain how ordinary people in Nazi Germany could have supported an authoritarian regime. Many of his students insisted such a thing could never happen in modern society. Jones decided to test that assumption. He introduced a classroom movement built around discipline, unity, slogans, symbols, and a sense of collective purpose. Students were encouraged to participate in increasingly structured activities designed to create group identity and loyalty. What happened next surprised everyone involved. Students became deeply invested in the movement. Enthusiasm spread rapidly. Participation increased. Loyalty strengthened. Some students reportedly began monitoring the behavior of others and reporting perceived disloyalty. Within days, what had begun as a classroom demonstration was taking on characteristics associated with authoritarian systems. Jones eventually revealed the true nature of the exercise and dismantled the movement. The experiment remains controversial because it was never intended as formal academic research. Nevertheless, it offers a powerful illustration of how belonging, certainty, and group identity can influence behavior. One of its most disturbing lessons is that authoritarian tendencies often do not emerge through fear alone. They can also emerge through excitement, purpose, unity, and the desire to be part of something larger than oneself. History's most dangerous movements rarely advertise themselves as dangerous in the beginning. The monster study. Few psychology experiments have generated as much ethical criticism as the monster study. Conducted in 1939, the research focused on speech development and stuttering. Researchers worked with orphaned children, dividing them into different groups and providing contrasting forms of feedback about their speech. Some children received encouragement and positive reinforcement. Others received repeated criticism and were told they showed signs of speech problems, even when no such problems existed. The goal was to examine whether negative feedback could contribute to speech difficulties. The methods used were deeply troubling. The participants were vulnerable children living in an orphanage. They were unable to provide informed consent in any meaningful sense. And many critics argue they were exposed to psychological harm in pursuit of scientific knowledge. The study became infamous not simply because of its findings, but because of the ethical questions it raised. It highlighted the dangers of treating human beings as research subjects rather than individuals deserving protection and dignity. Beyond its ethical legacy, the monster study revealed something psychologically important. Human beings are profoundly influenced by labels and expectations. When authority figures repeatedly communicate negative messages, those messages can shape self-perception and behavior. Expectations have power. Beliefs have power. Labels have power. The consequences can last far longer than the experiment itself. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Few social experiments have achieved the cultural influence of the Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo transformed part of Stanford University into a simulated prison. Student volunteers were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners. The study was intended to examine how social roles influence behavior. What followed became one of the most famous episodes in psychology history. The guards quickly adopted increasingly authoritarian behavior. Some prisoners became passive, anxious, and emotionally distressed. Tensions escalated so rapidly that the experiment was terminated after only 6 days. The original interpretation was dramatic. The study appeared to suggest that ordinary individuals could become cruel or submissive simply by occupying particular social roles. Over time, however, the experiment became the subject of intense debate. Critics questioned aspects of the methodology, researcher involvement, and the extent to which participants may have been influenced by expectations. Yet even with those criticisms, the Stanford Prison Experiment remains important. The study helped popularize a profound idea: environments matter, institutions matter, roles matter. Human behavior cannot always be understood by examining personality alone. The systems people inhabit often shape what they believe is acceptable, expected, or normal. The experiment's enduring influence reflects a broader truth. Power does not simply change what people can do. It can change what they believe they should do. That distinction may be one of the most important lessons in all of psychology. The Milgram obedience experiment. If one experiment deserves the title of the most chilling social experiment ever conducted, it is Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. The study emerged from one of the darkest questions of the 20th century. How could ordinary people participate in harmful actions simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so? Participants believed they were taking part in a learning experiment involving electric shocks. They were instructed to administer increasingly powerful shocks to another participant whenever mistakes were made during a memory task. The shocks were not real. The participant receiving them was an actor. The distress displayed, however, appeared completely genuine. As the voltage increased, the learner protested, pleaded, shouted, and eventually fell silent. Throughout the process, an authority figure calmly instructed participants to continue. Many participants showed visible signs of discomfort. Some sweated. Some trembled. Some questioned the procedure. Yet most continued. In the most famous version of the experiment, approximately 65% of participants delivered what they believed were potentially lethal shocks, simply because an authority figure instructed them to proceed. The result shocked the world. Milgram did not discover that people enjoy harming others. In fact, many participants clearly did not. What he discovered was arguably more disturbing. People often obey authority even when doing so conflicts with their personal conscience. The experiment revealed how responsibility can be psychologically transferred. Participants frequently appeared to view themselves as instruments carrying out instructions rather than autonomous moral decision-makers. That insight continues to shape research into leadership, institutions, organizations, military structures, and political systems. The most unsettling aspect is that the participants were not unusual. They were ordinary people drawn from everyday life. That is precisely why the findings remain so powerful. What these experiments really revealed. Viewed individually, each experiment appears to answer a different question. One examined obedience. Another explored conformity. Others focused on prejudice, authority, helping behavior, group conflict, or social influence. Taken together, however, they reveal a far more significant pattern. Human behavior is heavily shaped by context. This idea remains one of the most important discoveries in psychology. People often assume behavior flows primarily from personality. We like to believe that good people consistently make good choices, and that bad people consistently make bad ones. The reality is often far more complicated. Many of the participants involved in these experiments would have described themselves as decent, ethical individuals, yet under the right conditions. Some ignored people in need, conformed to obviously incorrect opinions, obeyed questionable authority figures, accepted arbitrary hierarchies, or became increasingly hostile toward perceived rivals. The experiments suggest that morality does not operate in isolation. It exists within social environments that constantly influence judgment and decision-making. The hidden power of authority. One of the strongest themes running through these studies is the influence of authority. Milgram demonstrated how powerful direct instructions can be. Hoefling revealed that authority retains influence even among highly trained professionals. The Stanford prison experiment suggested that institutional structures can encourage behavior people would never display under normal circumstances. Authority is not inherently dangerous. Every functioning society depends on trusted leaders, experts, and institutions. Without authority, cooperation becomes difficult, and large-scale organizations struggle to function. The danger emerges when authority becomes insulated from challenge. Many participants in obedience studies were not convinced their actions were correct. They continued because somebody they perceived as legitimate instructed them to do so. This creates an important lesson for modern organizations. Healthy institutions do not simply require leadership. They require mechanisms that allow individuals to question leadership when necessary. The ability to challenge authority may be one of the strongest protections against abuse of power. Why groups change how we think. Another recurring theme is the extraordinary influence of groups. The Ash experiments showed that people can doubt their own perceptions when surrounded by a unanimous majority. The Robbers Cave experiment demonstrated how quickly tribal identities emerge. The third wave revealed how powerful collective movements can become in remarkably short periods of time. Humans are social creatures. Throughout most of history, belonging to a group was essential for survival. Exclusion often carried serious consequences. As a result, the desire for acceptance remains deeply embedded in human psychology. Most conformity does not occur because people are weak. It occurs because social harmony feels safe. Disagreement creates uncertainty, tension, and potential conflict. Going along with the group often feels easier. This tendency helps explain why misinformation spreads, why workplace cultures become entrenched, and why public opinion can sometimes shift with surprising speed. People do not merely absorb information from groups. Groups shape reality itself. The danger of labels and expectations. Several experiments demonstrated another powerful psychological force: expectations. The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment showed how quickly arbitrary labels influence behavior and self-perception. The monster study illustrated the damage that negative expectations can inflict upon vulnerable individuals. Human beings constantly receive signals about who they are supposed to be. Some come from parents, some come from teachers, some come from employers, institutions, peers, and society itself. Positive expectations can encourage confidence, resilience, and achievement. Negative expectations can undermine performance and shape identity in damaging ways. Psychologists often refer to this phenomenon as a self-fulfilling prophecy. People frequently become influenced by the assumptions that surround them. The lesson is simple but profound. The labels we assign to others matter more than we realize. And the labels we accept about ourselves matter even more. The modern world is one giant social experiment. When many of these studies were conducted, researchers worked with dozens of participants at a time. Today, technology platforms interact with billions. The Facebook emotional contagion experiment represented a turning point because it highlighted the scale at which behavior can now be influenced. Digital environments shape attention, emotion, perception, and social interaction in ways that previous generations never experienced. Algorithms determine which information receives visibility, Platforms influence which opinions gain attention. Recommendation systems shape what people watch, read, and discuss. Social feedback mechanisms reward certain behaviors while discouraging others. None of this means individuals lack free will. However, it does mean that modern environments exert powerful psychological influence. Many of the forces identified by 20th century psychologists have not disappeared. They have simply become digital. Conformity, authority, social proof, emotional contagion, and group identity continue to operate, often on a scale unimaginable to the researchers who first documented them. Could you have resisted? This is the question that gives these experiments their enduring power. Most readers instinctively believe they would have behaved differently. They would have challenged the group, ignored the pressure, questioned the authority figure, helped the stranger, rejected the unfair hierarchy, refused the order. Perhaps some would have. Many participants in these studies did resist. Some challenged authority. Some refused to conform. Some acted courageously, despite social pressure. But the experiments demonstrated something important. Resistance is often far harder than it appears from the outside. The people who participated were not villains. They were ordinary individuals navigating situations carefully designed to exploit common psychological tendencies. That is why these experiments remain so fascinating decades later. They force us to confront the gap between who we believe we are and how we might actually behave under pressure, the uncomfortable truth about human nature. The most disturbing lesson from these experiments is not that people are cruel, selfish, or easily manipulated. It is that human behavior is profoundly shaped by circumstances. Under supportive conditions, people cooperate, help strangers, challenge injustice, and act with remarkable courage. Under different conditions, the very same individuals may conform, obey, remain silent, or look the other way. Human nature contains both possibilities. The experiments on this list exposed the hidden forces that determine which version emerges. Perhaps that is why they continue to resonate. They are not really stories about psychology laboratories, university researchers, or long-forgotten studies. They are stories about us, and the uncomfortable possibility that the most important factor shaping our decisions is not who we are, but the situation we find ourselves in when the moment of choice finally arrives.